everybody, and welcome back to another episode on Peter Herman Adventures. Today I'm going to be talking about floats. I find a lot of floats in the river. When I'm swimming in the river, I get to a lot of little spots where other people can't get to, in behind log jams, little back eddies, and I end up picking up a lot of floats. So here I'm going to show you my collection from about the last year or so. Here we are, a nice pile. I don't know how many floats are in there, but probably a couple of hundred. So when you show up to a tackle store, you might be wondering, what the heck do I buy? And what's the difference? And what are they all good for? So that's going to be today's episode. I'm going to pick through the pile a bit. I'm going to show you a bunch of different floats. And I'm going to talk about what each kind of float is best at, and how to rig them up and how to use them, all those little things. So I'm going to start off with my favorite float. This is my personal favorite. These are the exact ones that I like to fish. I'm not hung up on them. I fish whatever the river provides, but given a choice, these are the floats that I use. And the reason I use them is because they're very stealthy. So when you look at this float from underwater, this is the profile that you see. They're white from underneath, and they're very low visibility when they're floating along on the surface. So this is a 25 gram, and this is a 20 gram. They come in these two basic colors, chartreuse and orange. And for low light fishing, so first light and last light, I really like the way these yellow ones work. I can see that yellow way clearer, especially at a distance, than I can the orange. During the day, and especially in big water, the orange shows up a little bit better, so you kind of have your choice there. The way that you rig up these floats is you can put them on your line and stick a toothpick in it, and then you have a fixed float. Or you can use bobber stoppers. So bobber stoppers are these little guys. They come pre-strung, and all you do is you slide your line through this little loop, then you pull on them, and they slide onto your line. So when I'm rigging my float, I'll show you how I do it. I'll just grab my rod and hold it up. Okay, so I have below the bobber, and you can call them bobbers or floats. It's the same thing, different word for the same thing. So below the float, I have one bobber stopper. And that keeps that float from running away if I break my line right at the weights. And above the bobber stopper, I have, mixing up my words again. Above the float, I have two bobber stoppers. And that's because, especially when it's cold and rainy and the line is wet, those bobber stoppers tend to slide around. So I find that two of them stay put a lot better than just one. So that's how I rig those. My favorite float. And Clear Drift, by the way, is a local BC company, so that's why I like their brand, and I'm kind of loyal to that name. They also make awesome beads, and I use those a lot. So here are a few more clear floats. Not all of these are made by Clear Drift. Some of them are made by other companies. There are a lot of different brands out there, and I just want to mention what's good about these floats and what's not good about these floats. Like I said, they're my favorite, but there are some disadvantages. So the big deal is that they're very low visibility from underneath. The fish don't seem to mind them very much. And the river that I fish is a medium-sized river. This one behind me, it's usually sort of 100 feet across, and it's not that deep, and it's often very clear. So being stealthy is important. If you're fishing a big river or a river that's not that clear, then this clear float is not really an advantage. So for me, they're great because they're stealthy, but there are some disadvantages. One of them is that they're kind of expensive. So this float is maybe, I don't know, $4, sometimes $5. And if you're new to river fishing, you're gonna lose quite a few floats. So buying expensive floats maybe is not the best thing for you. The other disadvantage is that they're kind of fragile. So if you sit on this float or step on it, or if you bash it against some rocks, the float cracks and fills up with water, and then it's useless. Okay, one other thing that I wanted to mention is the difference in shape. So you have short stubby floats. Those are in Clear Drift calls them the Big Water series. And then you have these long slender floats, and Clear Drift calls those the Seeker series. And there is a bit of a difference in action on those. When you're floating on a river, most of the wavelets are kind of small. So when you have a short stubby float, it bobs up and down with every little ripple and wavelet. And I like that because it gives my presentation underwater a little bit of a jiggling action. These Seeker floats, the taller ones, they tend to stay put more. So when a wavelet comes along, the float will actually kind of submerge and it stays much more steady. So it gives you a smooth, natural presentation underwater. It's a very tiny difference, but depending on what you want your presentation to do, you might choose between a long slender float and a short stubby float. They do different things underwater. Next on the list are the D&E floats. These are by far the most popular floats on the Vedder River. At least they're the ones that I find the most of, especially during salmon season. So it kind of varies. A lot of steelhead fishermen like the clear drifts, but during salmon season, most people use these floats. They come in 4 different colors: white, gray, green, and black. And theoretically, you want to try and match your float to the sky. So if you're fishing under a white overcast sky, you would pick a white float. Gray overcast, you're picking a gray float. If you're fishing under a bunch of trees and covered banks, then you might pick a green one. Black one, well, that one is not very stealthy, but if you're fishing deep pools or if you're fishing muddy water, then it really doesn't matter what color your float is. These get rigged the same way as the clear drift floats that I showed before, so you can do bobber stoppers above and below, or you can just stick a toothpick in them and make them a fixed float. These floats are a little bit more economical than the clear drift floats, so they're, I don't know, probably about $3 per float, and they're a great all-around choice. So the next most common float that's used around here are these, most people call them dink floats or tube floats. So these are probably the cheapest floats that you can buy. They range from $1 to $2, and they're also very popular. These floats are rigged by sliding your line through this tube at the top. You slide it through, and then you do a spiral, 1 to 2 wraps, usually just 1 wrap. You can kind of see it here. You do a spiral around the float, and then it comes out the bottom. So this float is a fixed float, it won't slide, and it's very easy to adjust. So when you need to adjust, you just push on the bottom and pull out on top, and you've quickly adjusted the depth on your float. If you're new to fishing and you lose a lot of floats, this might be the perfect choice for you. The one thing that these floats are not great at is if you get snagged up and you pull on your float quite hard, the line cuts into the float, and when you do that a couple of times, the line will actually cut through the float, so they don't last a really long time. So next on the list are a variety of Cork and Balsam floats. So what the heck are these guys for? Well, when you're center pin fishing, and especially when you're learning to cast a center pin, it's good to have a little bit more weight to your presentation to make it easier to cast. So choosing a little bit of a bigger float, like this one's probably a 35 gram or so. Here's another 35 gram. So the weight of the float has a little bit more heft there, and also you put a little bit more lead under there. You have a presentation that's much easier to cast with a center pin. So these various balsa wood floats are, they're quite popular. The other big advantage with balsa and cork is that they're biodegradable. So when you lose that float down the river, you don't have to worry about it polluting the oceans for years to come. That wood is going to fall apart, and it's going to leave very little trace in nature. So that to me is a big selling point of cork and balsa. is the fact that they're biodegradable. One more very interesting option on the market are these stemmed floats. They're made by a few different companies, and just like the other floats I mentioned, they can be rigged as a slip float or a fixed float. Here's a couple 25 grams for DM&E and 30 gram from Zeppler. Now, why a stemmed float? What the heck is the difference? The difference is that this little stem holds your line off the water just a little bit. So when you're fishing a long rod on the river, you can actually have your line going from your float across the surface without ever touching it. And also when you're fishing, when the current tilts your float a little bit, you can really see how it's tilting. So even at a distance, you can gauge really accurately what kind of holdback you're fishing with. And for that reason, a lot of people like these little stemmed floats. So as you can see, there's a huge variety of choices when it comes to picking a float. And in many ways, it's like picking a car. Every car you pick will get you there, some more reliably than others. But it's the same thing with a float. A float, all it does is it keeps your weight a constant distance off the bottom. And so, it doesn't really matter what the float is. It's all about picking a float that works best for your particular situation, your skill level, and the fish that you're targeting. And so the answer isn't always the same. If you're fishing a big river with big water and big heavy water, you probably want a bigger float so that you can use more weight to get your presentation down into the strike zone quickly. If you're fishing a small river, you probably want to pick a smaller float that's less disruptive to the fish and spooks them less as you're fishing. So probably the biggest decision you need to make is whether you want to go with a sliding float or a fixed float. So a sliding float goes up and down the line freely to a stop at the top and the bottom, and that allows you to cast with a short, your presentation is short, and it allows you to cast and still fish really deep water. A fixed float is probably best if you're fishing a constant depth of water and where your depth of water isn't more than about 4 or 5 feet. Then a fixed float works just fine. And no matter what float you pick, you can adjust your depth fairly quickly. So like I said, it's like buying a car. Some people like one thing, some people like another thing. There is no right or wrong answer. It's whatever appeals to you and whatever works for your particular fishing situation. Thanks for watching, and good luck out there.